Professor Boyle. I heard that you were going to be here, but that for various reasons that I think people know, paperwork reasons perhaps, he couldn't make it here. So we're going to have to do this online. But yes, I mean, as a bust publisher who's trying to find their feet again, it's really interesting to talk about bust writing and publishing. And I've been listening to the morning sessions with great attention and interest. But what strikes me about Professor Boyle, who's writer, poet, publisher, also someone who started up a publishing house, CB Editions, is that there always seems to be something you're doing to get out of bust into boom. I mean, you have taken on pseudonyms to write fiction. You have decided to start a publishing house when you couldn't find, I read, the right publisher for poetry that you wanted to publish, which just seems to me the perfect way to now, these days, negotiate even the literary spaces, because they are fast closing in. The mainstreaming of everything is the bane of experimental writing, writing that you really wish more people would discover. And in these movements away from the mainstream, I think is where real creativity and literary activism lies. So I'm delighted to be able to listen to you, and hopefully we will ask you some questions later, but handing over to you now. Thank you.
Karthika, thank you very, very much. Sanchit, is this working? Can everybody hear me? Yeah. I hope so. I have never been invited to an occasion of this kind before, which means I feel completely qualified to be here. And I'm only so sorry that I can't be with you in person. There were bureaucratic problems, there were health problems, but let's see how it works. Is this working? I'll carry on then.
It's working.
Fine, thank you. I thank Sanchit and I thank Amit and I thank everybody who has made this happen. I've added a subtitle, by the way. We now have bust writers, bust publishers, a dance with improvised steps. In 1979, a man I know, a Welshman who translates from the Spanish, met a man named Roberto in a bar in a village in the south of France. And they talked about William Burroughs because the Welshman happened to be reading Burroughs. And later, they sat with more wine on a bench in a dusty park and watched some gypsy children playing football. Roberto joined in. Richard, by now so drunk that he didn't trust his legs to hold him upright, stayed seated. Richard believes that the man he met was Roberto Bolaño. A quote from a talk that Richard gave in Santiago that was based on this episode. He seemed to have an intense grasp of world literature, had the wild range and anarchic confidence of the autodidact, which I recognized. And he seemed to really like talking, enjoyed the chase of ideas and wordplay and of any insane incongruence that came along. Now, whether this particular Roberto was Bolaño or not, I don't think really matters. I happen to believe with Richard that it was. In 1979, Richard was 23 and Bolaño was 26. Richard was bust. He had quit the UK when Margaret Thatcher was elected into power, and he went to southern France and Spain, vagabonding. He was young. Life is not easier when you are young, but decision-making sometimes is. And he went to pick grapes and drink them, up to around 7 litres of cheap wine per day. The other guy was also bust. I think Bolaño at the time was starting to write the pieces that make up Antwerp, that unpublishable at the time book of anarchic confidence that is seen now following Bolaño's ascension as, I quote from the cover, the big bang of his creative universe. Fast forward a decade or two, or 3 or 4. Bolaño died in 2003 at the age of 50 while waiting for a liver transplant and is now a star of global literature. Richard did get a liver transplant and became a university professor of creative and critical writing. He has described attending a literary conference in Barcelona. From the window of his hotel room, he looked out on the market stalls of Las Ramblas, under which during his vagrant years he had slept. From another hotel room, this one in Paris in 1978, Lawrence Durrell looked out on the city in which he had run around with Henry Miller and Anais Nin in 40 years before. Durrell in 1978 was in the boom stage of his life, a major beast, a member of the literary firmament. But he discovered a tenuous shop-bought link to his bust stage. He spent the night of the 31st of December with a woman who wore a perfume named after Anais Nin. 10 days later, he wrote to Henry Miller, "I lay there in the dark, smelling it and thinking, and never saying a word." Authors become aromas? Author names become brand names? File that perfume with the Samuel Beckett fridge magnets, the Pessoa tea towels, the James Joyce t-shirts, and the Bolaño t-shirts too, and the Bolaño 2666 beach towel. At the core of 2666 are the unsolved murders and rape and mutilation of several hundred women in Mexico, forensically recorded. For $35, you can lie on the beach on a Bolaño 2666 towel, quote from the ad, made from brushed microfiber with 100% cotton back for extra absorption. I'm using the terms boom and bust quite loosely here. Like most simple binaries, the terms don't always fit neatly, but they do offer a framework for talking. And in writers' so-called careers, bust to boom, and sometimes vice versa, is a perceived trajectory, from messing around in cafes to ordering room service on an expense account, from calling your dealer to calling not just your dealer, but your agent and your lawyer and your accountant too. What happens along the way? I am not sure that the work is always, as Amit put it in his mission statement, annulled. I'll mention here another man I know, an Irishman this time, who came across some books by Bolaño on my shelves and borrowed one. And within weeks, he too had quit the UK and headed to the south of France. Bust or boom, books can change lives. And I think work's worth can survive however it is framed, marketed, sold, press-ganged into alien agendas, or ignored. But yes, during the movement from bust to boom, something is lost, or stolen, or sold short, or surrendered, or forgotten, or just goes missing. And now I'm going to talk for a little while about publishing, because I think that's why I'm here. Because I worked in mainstream publishing for more years than I care to remember, including 14 years in backroom jobs, that's copy editing and typesetting, at Faber and Faber, before going it alone. For mainstream publishing, I offer you two images. First, there was a photo of last year's Booker Prize winner a week or so after the prize. He's sitting slumped at a table in what looks like the back room of a discount warehouse, head down on a table stacked with hardback copies of his book. After doing 60 interviews, he is now required to sign 2,000 copies of his book in one sitting. I've actually seen this happen. It needs a team of 4. One intern opens the books, passes to the writer, who signs. Another intern restacks in piles, another makes coffee. The interns are, quote, learning how publishing works, stop quote. Second image, a wickerwork trolley filled with manuscripts. In shape and size, think of a shopping trolley, the kind you see tugged along by people with bad backs coming back from the mall. But those ones tend to be waterproof. When I joined Faber in the early 1990s, this trolley belonged to Frank, who wheeled it every day from the post room to his office. The manuscripts were the so-called slush pile sent in by helpful writers, and Frank spent his days panning for gold. If I remember rightly, Frank found Upamanyu Chatterjee's English August in this trolley. For the past several years, Faber's website, and those of other big publishers, has stated, unfortunately, we are not in a position to review unsolicited manuscripts. You need an agent. While the range of writers making it through to publication has expanded, the route from outside to inside is now policed by more, not fewer, gatekeepers. I'm a gatekeeper myself. As a small press publisher, I say no to many more writers than I say yes to. My own venture began in 2007. It is ramshackle, and it doesn't make money, and it has no Arts Council funding, and was started by accident, and I have never learned how to make a spreadsheet, and I probably never will. And by saying those things, I am framing it, whether I want to or not, in a bust tradition. I'll begin with Richard, the Welshman who met Bolaño, and whom I first met online. In 2011, Richard published on his blog some draft translations of poems by an Argentinian poet, Joaquin Giannuzzi, who died in 2004. I liked them, and I emailed Richard, and the following year we published a bilingual edition of his translations of selected poems by Giannuzzi. Incidentally, the first poem in the book is titled Garbage at Daybreak. Garbage collecting, of course, was one of Bolaño's down-at-heel jobs back in the early years. And here are lines from the final stanza. Quote, "It seems that culture consists in the thorough tormenting of matter and pushing it through an implacable intestine." End of quote. Richard persuaded his university to fund a mini festival in Cardiff, where I met Latin American writers and translators who were new to me. To date, the book of Giannuzzi's poems has sold 71 copies to bookshops and 54 copies to individual readers ordering from the website. I sent out review copies, which resulted in 2 reviews in small circulation Welsh and Scottish magazines, and I must have given away quite a few, because actually I've only got 3 copies left. And when those are sold, the book will go out of print. None of us has a long shelf life. 71 plus 54 equals 125. Small numbers. Of course, I'd like them bigger, but not too big, because I'd get swamped. The trick may be in keeping them at ground level. In January this year, I published a book that sold out its first print run of 500 within a week of publication. And as much as I was riding high, I was also on the back foot, juggling the cash flow to pay for a reprint. My publishing is not a numbers game, but here are a few more, just for context. Back in 2007, a legacy of £2,000 from an uncle who made it to the age of 100, then quit, funded the printing of 250 copies each of 4 books. And that was supposed to be that. But I was enjoying this, and so another 4 books the next year, and the next, and the next, and they earned their keep, just about. And to date, there have been around 80 titles. A very few have sold more than 3,000 copies. Many more have sold around 100. Enough numbers. Much more interesting is how some of the authors I publish involve themselves in the curation of the list. Writer A tells me about meeting B, who has been translating C from the French for years, not for publication, but just for the fun of using those muscles. I publish them. And while in America, B hears D from Mexico reading from her manuscript. Can she send it? She did. I published it. E, who lets me publish her stories, not least because I also published the Hungarian writer F, whom E once stayed up all night reading through to dawn, takes some copies of her book to New York, where she meets and hangs out with G, who of course sends me his poems, and they are good, and I publish them too. H, who is Polish, is constantly trying to interest me in little-known Polish writers from the early and mid-20th century, and I've published his translations of 2 of them. I also seem to attract less actively social writers, ones in whom a desire for recognition conflicts with a wariness about the whole business of publishing. After I'd taken on a book-length narrative poem by J, I found he had written about half a dozen other books. He was a self-taught bookbinder, and he had hand-bound a couple of copies of each, showed these to 2 or 3 friends who were completely non-literary, and when they returned them, he had put them under his bed and started a new book. J is now a prize-winning author with a much larger publisher, and he is still conflicted. K in France sent me a very short book he had been working on for 30 years without seriously attempting to publish it. When I took round finished copies of the book by L, which I published 7 weeks after reading the manuscript because he had cancer and was dying, he suggested I take a copy to his local bookshop where he was a regular customer. And they said, yes, lovely man, but we didn't know he was a writer. M is a poet I said no to. And then 2 years later reconsidered at 3 in the morning one sleepless night. And he hadn't sent the poems anywhere else. He'd just been waiting for me to change my mind. And by breakfast time, this book was on track. M writes under a pen name, as I do sometimes, and there is almost no evidence of this man's existence, certainly no photos, and he refuses offers of readings, and I have never met him, though we live in the same city, and I am frankly terrified of the several hundred new poems he would like me to publish, but I can't do everything. These people are my tribe. Here they all are, quarreling, teasing, belonging, even the shy ones. And I could get sentimental about this, and sometimes I do. Some of them might feel at home in Bolaño's stories of stubborn, fragile, haunted, obsessive, drifting writers. One of those stories features a little magazine named White Rope, from which the narrator was excluded. Quote, 2 Chileans was 2 Chilean too many for the first issue of a little magazine devoted to Spanish writing, end quote, and which folded after just 1 issue. In 2015, I started a little magazine myself. It was called Son of a Book, and it lasted for 2 issues. After the first issue, edited by myself, I put it in the hand of guest editors. The first guest editor never delivered. He was caring for his father, who became ill and then died. The next issue did appear, with almost all of the work in translation, but the very young child of the guest editor succumbed to a very rare illness and died. Soon after the editor of the next issue started work, her father became ill and died. I pulled the plug. When a project has a curse on it, there's not much else you can do. Small magazines were a characteristic feature of the alternative publishing scene in the UK in the period between the end of the Second World War and the coming of the internet, which is now, I think, can be seen as a very specific historical period. The magazines and pamphlets and broadsheets were often printed on office duplicating machines, and they were staple bound. And they were sold or bartered at book fairs, in drafty halls, at readings in pubs, and in radical independent bookshops. And most were short-lived. There were alliances, and then breakups and schisms. The people producing this material were typically, obviously I'm generalizing, male, white, working class, left-wing, and living quite far outside London and outside Oxford and Cambridge. This is Bolaño-esque. We now have the internet and digital printing too, but there are two ways in which my own venture may be considered a descendant of this bust tradition. One is the DIY aspect. I took all the typesetting and design, including the covers myself, and the queuing in the post office, and the accounts, and the dealing with printers, and the lugging of boxes of books around. The second way, the micro scale of this venture, allows for reading, writing, and publishing to be not discrete activities, but part of a continuum. A dance, if you like. When publishing becomes a specialized activity primarily devoted to making money, this dance becomes awkward. In a dance between a boom publisher and a bust writer, the partners are so unequal that the relationship is essentially predatory. Sometimes it goes wrong. The bust writer John Healey was alcoholic and homeless for more than a decade, sleeping rough. Because of the vagrancy laws in the UK at the time, he was often in prison, where he learned to play chess. He won tournaments, became a professional, but he gave that up after 5 years because chess too had become a stressful addiction. He wrote a memoir that was published by Faber in 1988, and the book sold many thousands and won the major UK prize for autobiography. And then Healey turned up at Faber's office one day to ask for money due to him. And when he was fobbed off, he said he'd come back with an axe. Or maybe a hammer. Accounts vary. Faber pulped the remaining copies of his book and told Healey they would never publish him again. Other publishers blacklisted him. 15 years later, the book was republished as a Penguin modern classic. But when you are in clinical depression, so what? In a documentary film about Healey, Faber's editorial director, the son of a headmaster of Eton, reminisces, quote, "We thought we were cutting edge, radical, new voices, but actually, when a new voice turned up, we didn't know what to do with it." End quote. The tricky terrain here was social class. Middle-class publishers and a working-class author, the son of Irish immigrants, both out of their comfort zones. Another form of predatory dance is big publishers letting smaller ones test the water first. Big publishers are not worried by the small ones, they use them. A number of books I have published that have gained acclaim, typically by winning prizes, those little badges that tell both you and everyone watching that you have arrived, have been taken over by larger publishers. And sometimes I'm left with boxes of books that I'm not legally allowed to sell. Never mind the fact that 99% of bust writers stay bust, which is another word for broken, and broke is another word for having no money. This process enacts the surefire rags to riches trope that sells books and becomes part of the perceived identity of those books, and often of the writers too. In any capitalist society, rags to riches, a trope in which I'd include survival against the odds and suffering followed by hope and redemption, and in general, happy endings, is the trump card, the trope they want you to buy into. And people generally do, even while knowing that very, very few make it through. And in fact, that the whole system is based on making it through being an exception. I don't for a moment hold it against writers that they move from a small publisher to a bigger one. They deserve more readers than I can deliver, and they have bills to pay. And if you have any self-awareness, then being in a bust tradition is hardly comfortable. It's cliquey, it's factional, and it's depressingly worthy. And it is romanticized. Being an outsider is not a lifestyle choice, it is hard. I am simply observing the interdependent but often strained relationship between boom, which has a homogenizing effect on the market. If you like X, we will also try to sell you Y, and bust, which defines itself against boom, but which really does want a stall in the marketplace. Just a little one, please. The marketplace, where we buy our vegetables and our underwear and our books too. Boom in publishing is basically about money with a veneer of culture, gloss lamination. Once we've subscribed to capitalism, this is how it is. And although we, preserving our cultivated disdain of money, know that success as defined by the marketplace does not mean that the writers of books that sell in their tens of thousands are better than the writers who sell far fewer, we are still infected by the sales charts. Money can empower, but it can also get in the way and skew judgment. I take no money when a writer I've published sells rights to their book to a larger publisher. A friend who runs a gallery in London takes no commission when an artwork she has shown is sold. In both cases, our failure to monetize indicates to many who should really know better that we are not serious players, that we are not professional. A certain glamour sometimes attaches to bust writers, to bust publishers and gallerists, less so. Back to numbers. If boom publishing is essentially about money, then Bolaño's publishers have to invest in him and sell as many books in as many possible territories as they can, because they can only make money by selling in mass volume. Between an editor's desk and a customer in a bookshop, there are others who take a cut along the way, and no one dines out off small print runs. For example, say in the UK, I publish a book with a cover title of £10. In the UK, the wholesaler who supplies most independent bookshops buys that book off the distributor at a discount of 60% off the cover price, sometimes more. After paying the printer's bill, and then the distributor's fee, and the sales agent's fee, and royalties to the author, I, as publisher, I'm left with 2 pence, more or less. Often now, with rising print costs, less. I said earlier that the trick was keeping the numbers at ground level, but below ground level? Failure is obviously more interesting than success. To write is to fail. Fail again, fail better, said Beckett, who failed so spectacularly that he won the Nobel Prize in Literature, giving credence to failure as a mark of authenticity, which is therefore co-opted, although not as an actual strategy, into boom publishing. Bolaño's backstory, the drifting, the illness, the working on campsites and other menial jobs, becomes the prelude to his global triumph. I recently read a short story by Shirley Hazard about an Italian scholar who works on his unfinishable book and meets up in the evenings with bookish friends at the local cafe. Quote, the possibility of worldly success had never by them been entertained. They conjectured only as to the form their failure would take. End quote. Failures forms a legion. And unless you think life and literature is a competition, most of them are not really failure at all. I'm still in touch with Connor, the Irishman who read Bolaño and went off to the south of France, where he still is. He reads, he gives English lessons, sometimes he writes. His liver is healthy. I was in Hungary in around 2009 with H, the Polish translator, whose real name is Vishek, when he bought a rundown house in a small town, a house abandoned for decades. I asked him what, after he'd fixed the place up, he would do there, and he looked at me as if I was stupid. Read, write, listen to music, do some translation, and harvest the berries from the mulberry tree in the back garden to distill bottles of the local liquor known as palinka. A year or so back, over glasses of palinka or similar, Vishek suggested we get a second-hand van, fill it with boxes of the books I publish, and drive around Europe, visiting independent bookshops that stock English language books. It would be fun. We would meet interesting people. We would have adventures. It could be a disaster. We might never speak to each other again, but worth trying? I told him that there would be post-Brexit customs difficulties, and that getting even friendly shops to take in books is hard, and there wasn't a chance we would cover our costs. But maybe that's not the point. Again, Vishek looked at me as if I was stupid. Well, I am stupid, and so is he. We like each other. And I realized while writing this that while both he and I flirt with success, not boom, a few hundred copies sold would be nice, a couple of good reviews in good places. The point is not success, failure, neither, but the dance we are engaged in. In this case, a dance in which the partners are equal and most of the steps are improvised. Finally, to give you a quite realistic idea of the scale of this operation, a very short poem by the German poet Gunther Eich, translated by Michael Hoffman. The title of the poem, which is ironic and hilarious, but is also absolutely serious, is Optimism. I have a reader in Salonika and another in Bad Neuheim. That makes 2 already. One more final paragraph because we resist completion. Here's a tip. Tickets at major galleries for the retrospective exhibitions of big-name artists, both the quick and the dead, are expensive. Sometimes, if you hang around the exit, where there may be nobody asking to see your ticket, you can get in free. I think some bust artists know this. And I think the galleries know this too, and they factor it into the ticket prices. It's like shoplifting. What you get going in from the exit is the official narrative in reverse. You start with the big, late paintings, loose, free, defiant energy, licensed by critical and commercial success, energized by rage against dying. High prices at auction. Only banks, oligarchs, and national galleries with massive state subsidy will be able to own these works. The middle rooms, dealers, prizes, money, marriages, schisms, travel, experimentation. Sometimes wilderness years and massive self-doubt and fragile recovery. The best-known works, the ones reproduced on the tote bags and the t-shirts, and they are extraordinary, are in these rooms. Eventually, you reach the first room. Small pieces using cheap materials. The work done while the artist was feeling their way, finding their peers, before there was a market for their work, let alone a secondary market, before they were they, before they had made their name, before a dealer had decided that their name was worth making, before they became their name, before their name became a fridge magnet. You have come a long way against the flow. Galleries are exhausting. Sit down, but there are never enough chairs. They want you in and then out to make room for more. You still have to weave through the gift shop and past the list of corporate sponsors and their logos. And then you go home, feed the kids, do the laundry, check your emails, and maybe you're right. Nobody is telling you to do this, and nobody is promising you any rewards. But equally, no one is stopping you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was quite marvelous. I felt entirely akin with everything that you were saying. I've been in big publishing houses. Have been in mid-sized and small publishing houses. And I think the word that you used last of scale, that is always the biggest problem for us. I think here in India, we have the same problems that you may have as a small publisher, but we have the additional problem, which is all Indian publishers working in the English language also have this big master sitting across in the UK or the US, and it's always a one-way process. The books have to come from the West to India, and this is a big market for them, but nothing ever goes from here to there unless it is an agented and locally published product. It's as though nobody there really needs to know or read material that comes out of here as a sort of almost organic, natural process. So just two things that came to mind when you were talking. One was this legendary story about Andrew Wiley, the agent, who I think had inspired younger agents by saying that your job is to get the biggest advance you can possibly get for a writer. And if royalties follow, then you failed, because really the agent's job is to take the biggest advance possible and run. I mean, it's not about making sure that the writer has a lifelong sort of royalty statement coming to them in the positive. The second thing is about a small publisher in the UK. I don't know if you remember them. They were called Beautiful Books, I think. And they started up really small. I remember going to the London Book Fair once, and they had a stall with a few books. And they published a writer who was Indian, who went on to win the Costa Prize for fiction, the first book prize. And they got so excited. They were a small publisher. They'd never, won anything. And they printed masses of this book, expecting it to then take off in a very big way, and had cash flow problems. They could not pay the printers in time. The book didn't sell as much, and they went bust. just on the strength of that one prize that should have actually transformed their destiny. So it's just, I think publishing is just full of weird and wonderful stories about people who just put everything they have into making it work. And then sometimes, like you do, clearly take a great deal of pleasure in what you do. And that just perhaps makes it all worthwhile, I think. It sounds like it. But then there are those who just work all the time trying to get the numbers and the data and just lose all the pleasure in what they're doing. And I just think it's nice to be smaller and take that everyday publishing just means working with people, working with writers of the sort that you, and the kind of a challenge that is to you on a daily basis, no other publishing or no other profession can offer, I think. So thank you for that talk. It just felt so resonant. I'm going to ask the audience if they have questions and direct them to you. Maybe you should come here and speak, right? Then he can see you if you have questions or comments. Anybody? That's strange. Does publishing silence writers and academics?
Karthika, a phrase you mentioned in the introduction, you used the phrase holding it together.
Yep.
I think that's what I spend a lot of my days doing. And there are times during every day when I feel it's all coming apart.
Yes, I know that feeling. But the one thing that you did not really, perhaps we didn't touch upon this, is do you feel that pressure of performance for your writers nowadays? Because we're feeling it a great deal here. They have to go to festivals, they have to be, on social media, they have to perform all the time the writing that they do or the mind behind the writing. Sometimes even the body behind the writing. I mean, some of the most popular writers now are those who have Insta handles that showcase them in the gym or doing wonderful, happy things. So is that performance angle important for your poets and writers?
Some of them enjoy doing it, fine. Some of them really do not enjoying it, also fine. I mentioned the writer who basically refuses to have any photographs of himself anywhere and who refuses offers of readings. And this is fine by me. It's I mean, if I like the work, I will publish the work. But I can do this at this scale.
That's true, actually. The bigger publishers, I think now, rarely seem to pick up even this or sign on a writer who does not have a presence.
Indeed. I think in some publishers' contracts with their writers, you actually have to sign along the dotted line to a contract that includes clauses that say you will tweet so many tweets per week or something like this.
I didn't know that. Okay. You want to ask? Yeah, sure.
Hi.
I think you may need to come up here, right? No, we can be seen. Perfect. A question for you.
Charles, thank you so much for that paper. I think in some ways you've stunned us into silence with some incredible contradictions. I don't know if it's sort of Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. I love that optimism poem. And it's, depressing sort of to readers. I don't really know what question I'm asking. It's just interesting that you seem to combine this cynicism, understandably, about the boom and the commercial nature of publishing with this grim, your story was punctuated with death, right? This terrible story of this short-lived periodical which has is cursed. And yet this will to keep on going, and that you're doing what you're doing. And you said sometimes you get sentimental, about your writers and your tribe and so on. So I think perhaps if you stunned us into silence, it's because I think we felt quite keenly, right, those contradictions, the sense of pessimism, cynicism, distrust of sentimentalization, of romanticizing the bust, and yet this extraordinary energy to keep going because it's worth doing it for reasons that may be difficult even to say.
There are good reasons and bad reasons. I mean, to be honest, I think my publishing to some extent is an addictive activity. As I said, I started the first 4 books. There were no plans to do any more, but I was enjoying this, so did another 4. And then another 4. And there was a period about 7 years ago when I was feeling pretty exhausted, and I kind of retired. But like many other addictions, actually, it's a lot more difficult to quit than just kind of carry on at a kind of, kind of cut down maybe. But I can't imagine not doing this really. I bet I don't make I'm in an extraordinarily privileged position to be able to do this. It was pure luck and chance that I worked in mainstream publishers' offices during the 90s when they had these new toys on their desks and they realized they could use them to design and to typeset and so on. So I picked up some basic know-how. So I can do this myself. I don't have to pay anybody else to do it. And being of a certain age, I know a few writers, and they know other writers, and we all kind of trust each other. So it's a position I work. This is only enabled by my having had a certain life experience.
Yeah. Sure. No, there is, but that's okay. No, please go ahead.
Hi.
Hello, Amit.
Hi. Hello. Just yeah, a couple of questions. One of them is personal in the sense of being related to your life as a publisher and possibly as a writer. And the other is asking you to sort of throw light on something to do with publishing. The first question is, observation is, well, you seem to have been on an adventure. I'm not sure exactly. I can't remember now the date of embarking on that adventure. You mentioned it, I think.
2007, that's 16 years ago.
2010. Yeah, so you were in Faber, and then you shifted, and then you embarked on an adventure. And Sartre says in a couple of places, he defines adventure as something that you cannot be aware of being in. It's only in retrospect that you realize that an adventure becomes an adventure in the recounting. Nobody, he says at least, is aware of being in an adventure. I'm in an adventure. And I've written about this in the past, and I've disagreed with it in the sense that one can be in an adventure if one embarks on something where one knows there's no assured outcome. If you're doing something with enthusiasm and you're not sure what the outcome will be, you're not sure if you're going to get any money from it, you're probably aware that you have embarked on an adventure. Now, I was wondering whether you were aware of being in an adventure at any point. That was the first question, or whether you don't think this is an adventure at all, or whether it became something that you became aware of over time, that I have been in an adventure for some years now. I don't know where it's going, but this is what's happening. I don't know why I'm in it, but I'm in one. Okay, that was one question. The other question has to do with mainstream publishing, because you were part of that as well, and you've been an observer, you've been part of that whole world. So as far as I can see, the new press, which by the way came up in conversation earlier today, the new press was created in the time of economic deregulation in the 90s, early 90s, 92. But it emerged as an important independent publisher in New York. I mean, that's at least what I'm getting from Wikipedia right now. I thought it was earlier that it came into existence, but Wikipedia says 1992, which was surprising to me. However, I have read an interview with Andreas Schifrin, where he says that the whole model for mainstream publishers was we publish the bestsellers to subsidize the writers we really want to publish. And that model did go out of the window with globalization and the free market, in the sense that even academic publishers like Cambridge University Press decided every writer will have to earn their keep. We are not subsidizing any writers. We are not selling, Bridget Jones's Diary in order to publish X, Y, or Z, who doesn't sell that much. Then I heard later on that there are that at a certain point of time, at least a few literary publishers realized that this model of every writer earning their keep, the overtly commercial model, wasn't working, even commercially, for these publishers. So I was wondering whether you had a sense that there's been any turn in the last 10 years in mainstream publishing towards taking stock of the kind of model they had adopted after globalization, or the kind of the spread of the free market as the only form of looking at finance and profit making and the economy, or whether whether it's got worse, or whether it's continues to be the same as it became in the world of the free market, conglomerates buying over publishing houses, and a whole new ethos coming into existence. So 2 questions, adventure and the other one.
I'll start with the other one. Oh, Lord. He's asking me a question as though I'm an expert. I'm not an expert. The new press that you mentioned was the venture that started up by Andrei Shifrin several years after he resigned, or was forced to resign, from Pantheon. Pantheon, which he'd worked at since, I think, 1961, in which he published Studs Terkel, Simone de Beauvoir, a whole lot of interesting, radical writers. And under that model of highly commercial imprints and books subsidizing lesser books which the sales department expected to sell fewer. To my mind, this was allowing so non-commercial books, in a sense, were being allowed to be published under license. And when the kind of corporate thing kind of turned over on itself and just started eating itself, that license was revoked. Because commercial capital only takes you so far. The bottom line basically said, Andrei Shifrin, you have lost us $3 million in the last year. You've got to cut your list or your titles, and he refused. It was a kind of moment. But I still think all the time Shifrin was at Pantheon publishing the radical list he did publish, Pantheon was owned by another company, which was in turn owned by another company, which is in turn owned by another company. These the takeovers and the globalization was actually kind of it hit the heights in the 1990s, but it had started to rumble before. And I have only a certain amount of respect for Shifrin. And then he wrote that book about I forget what the title, but the subtitle was how corporates have destroyed publishing and reading too. My copy of that book, which I have on the shelf next to me, on the back page it says printed in the UK by Amazon. In other words, pretty well the prime corporate that the book was written to open our eyes to the evil of. In other words, I think the globalization and the corporatization of publishing, there's almost no way out, except by, this is another word, except by kind of ducking down and finding the interstices and operating there. As for wither publishing, I'm the wrong person. As for adventure, I think, as I said, I started out with just 4 books, and that was supposed to be a way of spending the legacy left to me by my uncle. But I did have some very lucky breaks with those first 4 books. And you need lucky breaks as well. Those first 4, actually 2 of those 4 books. The 4 books were, one was a translation from the Polish by the guy I mentioned called Vishek. One was a short novel by a professional violinist who had taken his book to one of these agencies that sees a gap in the market and advises on manuscripts for a certain fee, and then takes the ones they think marketable onto an agent. And I was working for that agency at the time, and it was very depressing. And I came across this manuscript, and which I thought was wonderful. And I got in touch with the guy directly and published it. Incidentally, the manuscripts that come into that agency, these are by authors who are writing away in their garrets, and they want publication. And if they send to an agent, the agent either probably won't reply or will reply a year later saying just not for us. And the authors want some kind of feedback and help. So there are these in the UK anyway, there are these agencies. Then you can send your manuscript and pay money and get a professional essay on your work. And I was getting sent these manuscripts, which divided on the whole into two. One, there were the oddball things that some of them were funny, but not really interesting. Some of them were interesting in the sense that it was writing that really had to be written, and he didn't. But I couldn't see how any mainstream publisher would even begin to look at it. The bulk of the manuscripts that came in seemed to be carefully tailored for a position on the existing bookshelves. Look, there is that author, there is that author. Oh, there might just be a little space for me in between those two, if I can disguise myself as looking very like those. It was deeply depressing. And the two others of the first four titles were both by me, and one was a short novel. I published them both under pen names. Of course I did, because when you take books into a bookshop, and you don't have a distributor, and you put them in your backpack, and you take them into a bookshop, and the bookseller says, yes, who are these books by? If you say, well, they're actually by me, it's not really going to help. So they were both published under pseudonyms, and one of them won a prize. And I thought, and that was a lucky break, and I thought we can do this. And then the next year, I published one of Michael Hoffman's translations of his father's last novels, and I published a French poet called translations of a French poet called Francis Ponge, who Faber picked up and then just let go out of print. And as I say, it was becoming an adventure without me really knowing what was happening at all. There was no pre-planning to this. There was no marketing plan. There was no business plan. It was essentially making it up as I go along. At the point where I felt like, oh, I've had enough of this, about 7 years ago, I think one of the reasons I felt we can stop now was that to an extent, it had become a routine. 4 or 5 books a year, get the manuscripts in, talk with the authors, design them, send them to print, and it had become a little bit routine. So I actually cut down to kind of just 2 books a year, like I attempted to cut down on cigarettes. And then I'm now back up to 4 or 5 books a year. But yes, an adventure, but in retrospect, I had no idea what I was getting into.
Well,
Mr. Charles, why don't we have author like Salman Rushdie, who was quite writing in his famous or infamous, and he was assaulted also. The way we have a very turmoil situation in our whole world, whether it's Russia, Israel, and other parts of the world. Do you think we will be having some more this type of author in near future?
Many thanks for your question, which I didn't quite kind of get the gist of. Can you say it again? And I deeply apologize for
I
this.
think what he's saying, Charles, is that writers like Salman Rushdie, who sort of got into trouble about their politics, but also wrote against the grain. Is that the sort of writer we're going to see more of in these times? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Somewhat.
Again, crystal ball. I don't honestly know. I can't answer that question, I don't think. I would. Possibly, in the sense that I do think there is no what's writing for anyway. There's no simple answer to that. But I think the act of writing is a form of resistance against the world that you are given and asked to sign on the dotted line to. So yes. I'm sorry, I can't give a fuller answer.
Well, writing as resistance, I guess that's a good point to leave this at. Publishing can also be resistance, as you're
Yeah.
clearly showing with your work. And thank you very much. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Karthika.